The air was heavy with the scent of smoke and decay. Sergeant John Miller adjusted the lens of his Army-issued Graflex camera, his hands trembling slightly despite the cold. The 4x5 glass plates clinked softly in his satchel as he stepped through the gates of Buchenwald. The sign above the entrance, Jedem das Sein, mocked him in its cruel irony. He'd seen battlefields, towns reduced to rubble, soldiers broken by the horror of war. But nothing prepared him for this. Behind the barbed wire, a sea of faces stared back at him, hollow, skeletal, and expressionless. Some were barely alive, others beyond help. The smell was indescribable, sickness, death, and something that felt like the end of humanity itself. Miller's commanding officer, Captain Reynolds, murmured, "Photograph everything. Every building, every body, every mark. The world won't believe it unless they see it." John raised the camera, looking through the viewfinder. A gaunt man stood before him, too weak to stand straight, yet his eyes still burned with life. Behind him, a row of bodies lay on wooden planks, stacked like firewood. The shutter clicked, once, twice, 3 times, capturing evidence that would soon speak louder than any words. He moved slowly through the camp, documenting everything. Piles of shoes, children's toys, the ashes near the crematorium, the ledger books listing names that no longer mattered. Soldiers from his unit helped survivors, offering water, cutting wire, shouting for medics. Miller just kept shooting. He didn't cry, didn't speak. His training told him to stay detached, but the camera became more than a tool. It became a weapon against denial. Later that night, in a makeshift darkroom set up in a commandeered German farmhouse, Miller developed the first negatives. As the images surfaced in the chemical trays, ghostly shapes emerged. Faces of the dead, the hollow eyes of the living, the structures of systematic cruelty. Captain Reynolds stood behind him, silent. When the last print was lifted out of the tray, Reynolds whispered, These will change the world." He was right. Within weeks, Miller's photographs were sent to London, then Washington, and eventually to Nuremberg. They were classified as official evidence, proof of crimes so vast and deliberate that even seasoned generals struggled to describe them. Each image was a testimony, frozen in silver nitrate, that humanity had crossed a line it could never uncross. Miller, however, didn't feel like a hero. Each photograph was a wound, a moment of suffering he could never unsee. He often wondered whether taking those pictures was an act of justice or betrayal. Was he preserving truth or exploiting pain? That moral conflict haunted him long after the war. In the weeks that followed, he continued documenting the aftermath. Civilians searching for loved ones, liberated prisoners struggling to eat, American soldiers weeping at what they had found. And through it all, his camera never stopped. Somewhere deep down, Miller knew his photographs weren't just for generals or tribunals. They were for the world, for the generations that would one day ask, how could this happen? As dawn broke over the camp, Miller took one last photograph. A group of survivors standing behind the barbed wire, the morning light catching their hollow faces. One of them raised a trembling hand, not in anger, but in silent acknowledgement. The shutter clicked. That single frame would later appear in the courtroom at Nuremberg, projected before judges, lawyers, and the men who had built these camps. For the first time, silence filled the hall, not from disbelief, but from the unbearable weight of truth. The morning of April 11th, 1945, dawned gray and cold. The thunder of artillery had faded into distant echoes as the 6th Armored Division of the U.S. Third Army approached the outskirts of Weimar. Sergeant John Miller rode in the back of a jeep, camera cradled like a fragile relic. They had been told to expect resistance, snipers, maybe scattered Wehrmacht remnants, but instead they found a silence that felt unnatural. When the gates of Buchenwald came into view, the soldiers slowed. The massive stone pillars and iron bars stood like the mouth of something ancient and monstrous. A single guard post was empty, its door swinging in the wind. Then came the first figure, a man in rags, limping toward them, waving weakly. More followed, emerging from the fog, gaunt silhouettes, their striped uniforms hanging from bones. At first, the soldiers hesitated. "Are they civilians?" one asked. Another whispered, "No, they're prisoners." It took moments before the horror sank in. As they entered, the scale of what they saw defied comprehension. Barracks filled with men, too weak to rise. Bodies piled in the courtyards. A smell that penetrated the skin. Miller raised his camera instinctively, his training guiding him even as his soul recoiled. He began to photograph the liberation itself. Medics rushing in, soldiers handing out food and blankets, the confusion between relief and disbelief. One shot captured an American soldier removing his helmet, tears streaking down a face covered in dust. Another froze a survivor collapsing in gratitude, clinging to a medic's arm. Inside one of the barracks, Miller met a man who spoke halting English. His name was Jacob Rosenfeld. He had been a doctor before the war. His eyes were sunken but alert. "You must show them," Jacob said, gripping Miller's sleeve. "Promise me you will show them what they did." Miller didn't answer. He only nodded and adjusted his lens. The work continued for hours. Soldiers cleared buildings, uncovered hidden rooms where records were kept, detailed lists of prisoners, execution logs, medical experiments. Every discovery deepened the soldiers' silence. Even the toughest among them stopped speaking. When General Eisenhower arrived days later, he would insist that every soldier in the area visit the camp to witness the truth with their own eyes. "Lest future generations say this never happened," he said. By sunset, the camp was under full Allied control. Fires were lit for warmth, food distributed, doctors triaging the living from the dying. Miller set up his portable darkroom inside a commandeered SS office, the swastika still hanging crooked above the door. The irony wasn't lost on him. Under that same symbol, unimaginable cruelty had thrived. Now, under the same roof, he would make sure its crimes could never be erased. As the first photographs dried on the line, soldiers gathered around. None spoke. The images were raw, unfiltered, faces of death, suffering, and survival. A lieutenant whispered, This will haunt us forever." Miller thought of Jacob's plea. "You must show them." That night, Miller wrote a brief note in his field diary. "Today we liberated a place that defies reason. I've seen men die in battle, but this is different. This is what happens when hatred is given power. My camera feels heavier than any rifle." The following days brought more discoveries. Evidence rooms filled with personal belongings. Glasses, shoes, hair, children's toys. Miller photographed each in detail, knowing these small fragments would tell the human story behind the statistics. His photos captured not just horror, but testimony, the undeniable proof of systematic evil. Weeks later, when the prints reached command headquarters, the decision was made to classify them as evidence for the upcoming Nuremberg trials. Each frame was cataloged, marked Exhibit 305, Exhibit 306, and so on. They would become part of humanity's permanent record, the visual language of justice. But for Miller, liberation didn't feel like victory. It felt like a burden. He knew that the moment he pressed the shutter, he had taken responsibility for the truth. And truth, he realized, could be heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. As he packed his equipment at dusk, Jacob approached him once more, weak but standing. "You took pictures?" he asked. Miller nodded. Jacob smiled faintly, his face lit by the dying light. "Good," he said. "Now the world will see what we have seen." Miller looked through his lens one last time before leaving the camp. The survivors were huddled near the fires, their faces illuminated by the glow, fragile, human, alive. He pressed a shutter. Click! That photograph, taken in silence, would one day be projected before the judges at Nuremberg, the moment when the world could no longer look away. The negatives traveled hundreds of miles before they reached the Allied Documentation Center in Frankfurt, packed in steel cases and marked top secret. War Crimes Division, the photographs Sergeant John Miller had taken at Buchenwald were no longer his. They now belonged to history. Inside a repurposed German courthouse, a team of officers, translators, and archivists worked day and night cataloging evidence from across Europe: documents, letters, uniforms, medical reports, even human remains. Yet nothing spoke louder than the photographs. Paper could be forged, testimony could falter, but a photograph had no voice to lie. When the first set of Miller's prints arrived, Lieutenant Harold Beckman, a young lawyer assigned to the War Crimes Unit, examined them in silence. Spread across the table were scenes almost impossible to describe: the crematorium, the skeletal survivors, the twisted piles of corpses. He removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and said quietly, This is the case." Each photograph was numbered, stamped, and entered into the official archive. They were matched with witness statements, cross-referenced with SS records, and authenticated by forensic experts. The process was meticulous, part science, part ritual. Every detail mattered. If a single image was challenged in court, it could weaken the foundation of justice they were building. For Miller, the transition from soldier to witness was surreal. Weeks after the liberation, he was summoned to Frankfurt to give a deposition. He sat under harsh lights, his uniform pressed, his hands still scarred from the cold. Across from him, Beckman began the questioning. "Sergeant Miller, can you confirm that these photographs were taken by you at the Buchenwald concentration camp on April 11th and 12th, 1945? "Yes, sir," Miller answered. "Were they staged or altered in any way?" "No, sir. Everything you see was as we found it." "And can you testify that the individuals in these photographs were prisoners of the Nazi regime?" "I can. Many of them spoke to me before they died." The stenographer's keys clicked rapidly, capturing every word. For Miller, each question reopened the images in his mind. Not the photographs themselves, but the moments behind them, the smell, the silence, the eyes. After his testimony, Beckman thanked him. "Sergeant, you've done more than your duty. You've given the world its proof." Miller didn't feel proud. Proof, he thought, was a poor substitute for the lives lost. Meanwhile, in Nuremberg, preparations for the trial had begun. The courtroom inside the Palace of Justice was being fitted with translation booths, cameras, and projectors. The Allies intended to make this trial unlike any in history. Not just punishment, but documentation. The defendants would face the evidence of their crimes not as words on paper, but as images burned into film. Miller's photographs arrived among thousands of others, images from Dachau, Mauthausen, Bergen-Belsen. They were sorted into categories: camp conditions, execution evidence, medical experiments. Some were deemed too graphic for the public, but essential for the tribunal. A few were chosen for direct presentation, projected on massive screens before judges, journalists, and the accused. One image in particular stood out: the photograph Miller had taken of Jacob Rosenfeld and other survivors standing near the barbed wire, bathed in pale morning light. It was hauntingly quiet, almost peaceful, but the context made it unbearable. Prosecutor Thomas Dodd chose it for Exhibit 305. "This," he said, "shows the cost of silence. The world must look at it." When Miller learned that his photograph would be shown in the courtroom, he felt a strange mixture of pride and dread. He had wanted the world to see, but now that world included the men responsible. The thought that they might look upon their victims again, without remorse, filled him with a cold fury. As the months passed, newsreels and photographs began to circulate among the Allied nations. Civilians in New York, London, and Paris saw what had happened. Not propaganda, not rumor, but evidence. Newspapers called it the proof beyond doubt. People who had refused to believe the reports of extermination camps now faced the undeniable truth in black and white. Miller's images, though never credited publicly, became part of that revelation. His lens had turned atrocity into testimony. And yet, every night, he dreamed of the shutter clicking, the faces staring back at him. In the dark, he wondered if his camera had captured their suffering or stolen something sacred from it. When he returned to the camp months later, now empty and silent, the only sound was the wind moving through the barbed wire. The signs had been taken down, the prisoners gone, the watchtowers unmanned. But the ghosts remained, and Miller understood that his photographs were the only thing keeping them alive in the world's memory. The Palace of Justice in Nuremberg buzzed with attention that felt both electric and funereal. It was November 20th, 1945, the opening of the most significant trial in human history. Inside courtroom 600, the air was thick with anticipation and the scent of cigarette smoke. Military guards stood at attention. Translators adjusted their headsets, and journalists filled the press galleries, pens poised. At the front of the courtroom sat the 22 surviving leaders of the Third Reich, Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, and others, their faces pale, unreadable. Each wore headphones for simultaneous translation, their expressions caught between arrogance and dread. Behind them, the Allied prosecutors prepared their evidence: boxes of documents, reels of film, and stacks of photographs. Among them were the images Sergeant John Miller had taken at Buchenwald. As the session opened, Justice Lawrence read the indictment: crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The words echoed through the hall, but it was the evidence, not the rhetoric, that would define the proceedings. Chief Prosecutor Robert Jackson had insisted from the start, "We will let the evidence speak for itself." Miller sat in the gallery, a guest of the War Crimes Documentation Unit. He wore a civilian suit now, but his military posture remained. In his hands, he held a folded letter from Lieutenant Beckman, an invitation, but also a warning. What you will see here may haunt you more than what you saw there. When the first photographs were presented, the lights dimmed. The courtroom fell into a deep, almost sacred silence. On a large screen behind the judges, the first image appeared: a pile of corpses outside the crematorium, their limbs intertwined, skeletal and fragile. A murmur rippled through the audience. The defendants shifted uneasily in their seats. Then came Miller's photographs. The projectionist advanced the slide. The survivors behind the barbed wire, eyes hollow yet defiant. The next image showed the interior of a barrack, rows of emaciated prisoners lying on wooden bunks, staring at the lens as if through time itself. Jackson spoke softly, almost reverently. These photographs were taken by U.S. Army Signal Corps personnel on the day of liberation. They are not propaganda. They are the unaltered truth. A pause. Then the next image appeared. Jacob Rosenfeld standing beside other survivors, his skeletal frame illuminated by morning light. The judges leaned forward. Reporters stopped writing. Even the translators hesitated. From the defense table, Hermann Göring turned his head away, muttering something to his lawyer. Rudolf Hess stared blankly, his face twitching. Others simply looked down. For the first time, the power dynamic in the room shifted. The once mighty men of the Reich forced to face those they had tried to erase. As the final photograph lingered on the screen, a low sound broke the silence, someone quietly sobbing in the gallery. The court did not move. Jackson waited, allowing the image to speak. Then, in a steady voice, he said, "If we cannot see humanity here, we are not fit to call ourselves human." When the lights came back on, the defendants sat motionless. The spell had not lifted. The judges called for a recess, but no one stood immediately. It was as if the entire room needed time to breathe again. Afterward, in the hallway, Miller leaned against a marble pillar, trying to steady his thoughts. Beckman approached him with a faint, grim smile. "They saw it," he said. "They can never say they didn't." Miller nodded. "And yet, I wish they had never needed to." For weeks, the trial continued. Testimony from survivors, documents, footage from liberated camps. But it was the photographs that left the deepest mark. Newspapers across the world reprinted them, with headlines like "The Faces of Hell" and "Proof of the Unthinkable." In America, citizens lined up outside theaters showing the official war crimes newsreel, unable to look away, yet unable to forget. Behind the scenes, the prosecutors compiled the visual record. More than 5,000 photographs entered into evidence. Some were shown in court. Others were sealed for archives. But Miller's images, especially Exhibit 305, became iconic. They were reprinted in the tribunal's final report, labeled simply as evidence of systematic murder. For the first time in history, photography was not just illustration, it was justice. The cold precision of a camera lens had become a moral weapon. The power once used to glorify regimes was now used to destroy them. As the verdicts were read months later, death for Göring, Ribbentrop, and others, Miller sat quietly in the gallery, not cheering, not relieved. Justice, he thought, was necessary but insufficient. His photographs had shown the truth, but they could not restore what was lost. When he left Nuremberg that evening, the snow was falling lightly. He looked up at the dark German sky and thought of Jacob Rosenfeld, the man who had said, "Now the world will see." The world had seen. But Miller understood something the courtroom never could. Once you witness such darkness, it never fully leaves you. Even after the war ended, the photograph lingered in Private Jameson's mind like a shadow he could not shake. The image he had captured, the haunting faces of victims, the empty eyes of innocence lost, was more than just a photograph. It was a testament, a silent scream that demanded to be remembered. Returning to civilian life did not offer him the comfort he had hoped for. The streets of his hometown seemed trivial, almost surreal, compared to the horrors he had witnessed. Every sound, every glance at a child's face, seemed to echo the ghosts of the past. Jameson tried to settle into normality. He found work as a clerk in a small shipping company, a job that allowed him to blend into the quiet routines of everyday life. Yet, the war had etched its mark deep within him. At night, he would find himself opening the old leather case where the photograph was kept, staring at it under the dim glow of a lamp. He would trace the contours of the faces, memorizing the details again and again, as if the act of remembering could somehow honor the lives lost. The photograph became both a burden and a duty. Jameson knew that what he had captured was undeniable proof of atrocities committed by the Nazi regime, evidence that could help bring perpetrators to justice. But he also understood that society was not always ready to confront the full scope of such horrors. Even among fellow veterans, many preferred to forget, to bury the memories and move on. Speaking about the photograph was like opening a wound that refused to heal. He felt isolated, the weight of memory pressing down on him with every passing day. Friends and family noticed the change in him. Once cheerful and easygoing, Jameson now carried a solemnity that was impossible to ignore. They tried to distract him with ordinary conversation, to pull him back into the comfort of everyday life, but his mind was elsewhere. The faces in that photograph had become a permanent part of his consciousness. Jameson began keeping a diary, documenting not only his experiences during the war, but also his thoughts about the photograph and the responsibility it carried. Each entry was a quiet plea, a way to reconcile with memories that refused to fade. Over time, Jameson realized that the photograph had a life of its own. It was no longer just an image on paper. It had become a symbol of truth, a silent witness demanding acknowledgement. He began to correspond with historians and archivists, carefully sending copies of the photograph to those who might understand its significance. The reactions were varied. Some were horrified, some deeply moved, and a few even dismissed it as just another wartime image. But for Jameson, the photograph had a singular, unambiguous purpose: to ensure that the world could not ignore the reality of what had happened. Despite the passage of years, nightmares would often drag him back to the scenes he had witnessed. He would wake in the middle of the night, cold and shaking, certain that he could hear the distant cries of the victims. He knew that the photograph was more than a record of history. It was a bridge to memory, a link between the living and the dead. And though he sometimes wished he could forget, he understood that forgetting was impossible. The weight of memory was something he would carry for the rest of his life. The responsibility of holding the photograph also brought him closer to others who shared a similar burden. He began attending veterans' gatherings, speaking quietly with those who had seen the unimaginable. Together, they formed a fragile community of memory keepers, bound by the shared knowledge of human suffering and the moral imperative to remember. Jameson found solace in these connections, realizing that the photograph, painful as it was also had the power to unite those committed to truth and justice. And yet, the photograph remained a constant reminder of the personal cost of witnessing evil. Jameson often wondered how many others were carrying similar weights, silent and unseen. Each face in the image represented countless untold stories, and he felt compelled to honor them all. In private moments, he would whisper the names he could never know, speaking to ghosts as if naming them could grant some small measure of peace. It was a ritual of remembrance, a testament to the enduring power of memory and the unbreakable responsibility of bearing witness. By the time Private Jameson decided to take the photograph beyond the pages of his diary, the world was beginning to reckon with the aftermath of war. The Nuremberg trials were underway, a historic attempt to bring Nazi leaders to justice for crimes that had once seemed unspeakable. Jameson knew that his photograph could serve as irrefutable evidence, a visual testament to the atrocities that had been committed. But submitting it to the authorities was not as simple as handing over a piece of paper. He carried with him the weight of countless lives, a moral responsibility that demanded the utmost care. He traveled to the nearest Allied headquarters, photograph carefully wrapped in protective paper, and sought out the officers responsible for gathering evidence. His initial attempts were met with bureaucracy and skepticism. Some questioned the authenticity of a single photograph. Others were wary of relying too heavily on visual evidence in a world still grappling with disbelief. Jameson had to explain, repeatedly and patiently, the context of the image, where it was taken, the people involved, the circumstances under which it had been captured. Each explanation was an emotional trial, forcing him to relive moments he had spent years trying to compartmentalize. The photograph was finally examined by a team of experts who recognized its significance. For the first time since the day he snapped the shutter, Jameson felt a flicker of hope. The faces in the image were no longer confined to the shadows of his memory. They were entering the halls of justice, where they could speak on behalf of the victims. It was a solemn victory, one without fanfare, but profoundly meaningful. The photograph became part of a growing body of evidence that documented the systematic cruelty and inhumanity of the Nazi regime. As the trials progressed, Jameson was called to testify. Standing before judges, lawyers, and witnesses from around the world, he recounted the moments he had witnessed and the choices he had made. Each word carried the weight of memory, each sentence a delicate balance between emotional truth and factual precision. He described the photograph in meticulous detail, emphasizing its significance not as a mere image, but as proof of the human cost of ideology run amok. The courtroom listened in hushed attention, the gravity of his testimony settling over them like a heavy fog. Yet, even in this formal setting, the photograph demanded more than legal acknowledgement. It demanded recognition of its moral imperative. The faces in the image could not speak, but through Jameson, they found a voice. His testimony revealed the human stories behind the statistics, the names and faces behind the numbers that filled reports and government documents. Each witness, each survivor, each historian who examined the photograph added to a collective understanding of the scope of the crimes committed. It became clear that justice was not merely about punishment. It was about remembrance, about ensuring that history could not be rewritten or forgotten. Outside the courtroom, Jameson found that the photograph had an unexpected impact. Survivors and families of victims began reaching out, seeking confirmation, connection, or simply acknowledgement that their loved ones had been seen, remembered, and honored. Letters arrived from distant towns, from countries across Europe, each one a testament to the enduring resonance of the image. Some wrote to thank him for his courage. Others sought to provide context, to fill in the gaps that the photograph alone could not convey. In a way, the photograph had become a bridge between past and present, connecting people who had suffered in silence with a world that was finally beginning to recognize their pain. But the process of justice was slow and arduous, and Jameson soon realized that his role as a witness was far from over. The photograph continued to haunt him, reminding him of the limits of what could be achieved through law alone. Trials could convict and punish, but they could not erase the suffering, nor could they fully communicate the depth of loss. He wrestled with these contradictions, understanding that memory itself was both a tool and a burden. Every photograph, every testimony, every legal document carried a piece of that weight, a reminder that history was made up not only of events, but of the human experiences entwined with them. By the end of the trials, Jameson understood something profound. The photograph, once a personal burden, had become a symbol of collective memory. It had forced the world to confront a truth that many would have preferred to ignore, and it had given voice to those who could no longer speak. And while the echoes of the courtroom faded, the photograph remained, indelibly etched into the annals of history, a reminder that bearing witness is both a moral obligation and a path toward justice. After the trials, Private Jameson returned to civilian life once more, but the world he had left behind seemed irrevocably altered. His hometown had changed little, yet everything within him had shifted. The faces in the photograph haunted his dreams, and even the most mundane aspects of daily life. Children playing in the street, neighbors laughing over fences, the scent of fresh bread from the corner bakery, reminded him of what had been lost during the war. The photograph was no longer just evidence. It had become a lens through which he viewed the world, a constant reminder that evil could manifest in ordinary places, often unnoticed until it was too late. Jameson struggled to reconcile these memories with the expectations of those around him. Friends and neighbors wanted stories of heroism, of triumph over adversity, but Jameson's experiences were far more complex. There were no clean victories, no simple moments of glory, only human suffering, survival, and moral ambiguity. He found it difficult to share the truth without being misunderstood or dismissed. Some labeled him morbid or overly sensitive, unable to grasp the weight of memory he carried. Others recoiled from the vivid reality he described, preferring to maintain the comforting illusion that the horrors of war could be contained within books or films. To cope, Jameson began volunteering with local veterans organizations. He spoke at schools, small gatherings, and memorial ceremonies, recounting his experiences not for personal recognition, but to ensure that the lessons of the war would not be forgotten. The photograph accompanied him on these visits, carefully preserved in archival sleeves, never displayed recklessly, but always ready to serve as a visual testament to history. Children and young adults would stare at the faces frozen in time, some with curiosity, others with silent sorrow. Jameson realized that the power of the image lay not just in its ability to document, but in its capacity to evoke empathy, to make the abstract horrors of history tangible and personal. Despite these efforts, Jameson often felt isolated. The war had changed him in ways that words alone could not capture. The photograph served as both companion and reminder, but it also separated him from those who could not comprehend the depth of his experiences. He found solace in quiet walks through the countryside, where the rhythm of nature allowed him a temporary reprieve from the mental burdens he carried. Even here, however, traces of memory surfaced. A ruined barn, a distant plume of smoke, or the eerie stillness of an abandoned field could transport him back to Europe, to the forests and villages scarred by conflict. During these moments of solitude, Jameson reflected on the nature of memory itself. He realized that the photograph was more than a record of the past. It was a catalyst for reflection, for moral and emotional engagement. It demanded not passive acknowledgement, but active contemplation. The image had taught him that bearing witness is never purely objective. It is inherently personal, intertwined with grief, guilt, and responsibility. Memory, he understood, is both a gift and a burden, and the act of remembering is inseparable from the act of ethical reflection. Over time, Jameson also reconnected with the families of fellow soldiers. He discovered that many, like him, carried their own burdens of memory, photographs, letters, and keepsakes that told stories of comrades lost and horrors endured. Together, they formed a fragile network of shared experience, offering one another support and understanding in ways that few outside could. They discussed the moral challenges they had faced, the choices they had made, and the ways in which history continued to shape their present lives. In these circles, Jameson felt a measure of relief, a recognition that his struggles were not solitary, that memory itself could be communal, a shared responsibility across generations. Yet even within these supportive networks, the photograph remained a singular focus. Its impact was not limited to the past. It was a reminder of the vigilance required in the present. Jameson observed the post-war world with a cautious eye, wary of political movements, social apathy, and the subtle echoes of authoritarianism. He understood that the lessons of history must be actively maintained, or they risked being forgotten. The photograph, in its stark simplicity, reminded him that memory is not passive. It is a call to action, a challenge to remain alert, compassionate, and morally engaged. By the end of this chapter of his life, Jameson had accepted that he would never be free of the photograph, nor would he wish to be. It was no longer merely a record of horror. It was a symbol of duty, remembrance, and human resilience. The faces in the image, once silent witnesses, had become guides, shaping the way he moved through the world, informed his choices, and connected with others. In embracing the weight of memory, Jameson discovered a path toward understanding, one that linked the tragedies of the past to the responsibilities of the present. As years passed, the photograph began to transcend Jameson's personal experience, taking on a life of its own in the broader historical narrative. Scholars, journalists, and educators increasingly sought access to the image, recognizing its undeniable power to convey truths that words alone could not. It became a tool for teaching, a cautionary tale, and a symbol of accountability. Exhibitions in museums and archives displayed the photograph alongside testimonies, documents, and other artifacts, each adding layers of context and meaning. For Jameson, seeing the photograph in these settings was a mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride that the story was being told, sorrow that such events had ever occurred. He was often asked to speak at these exhibitions, to recount not only the events surrounding the photograph, but the personal journey of bearing witness. Each retelling was emotionally taxing. Recounting the faces in the image and the circumstances under which it was captured brought a rush of memory that was both vivid and painful. Yet he continued, understanding that the photograph's power depended on its audience. It was not enough for the image to exist in silence. It had to speak, to provoke reflection and confrontation with uncomfortable truths. Every lecture, every guided tour, every discussion with students was a chance to keep memory alive. The photograph also found its way into publications documenting the Holocaust and World War II atrocities. Historians emphasized its importance, noting that it represented an unflinching look at human cruelty and resilience. The details in the photograph, the expressions, the posture of victims, the traces of violence in the surroundings, offered insights that were impossible to glean from written records alone. In academic circles, the photograph was cited repeatedly, not only as evidence of crimes, but as a profound study of human suffering, morality, and the responsibility of those who witness injustice. Yet beyond academia, the photograph stirred debates about ethics, memory, and representation. Some questioned whether displaying such images was exploitative or traumatic. Others argued that avoiding these visual reminders risked erasing the reality of what had occurred. Jameson found himself in the midst of these discussions, advocating for careful contextualization, for presenting the image not as spectacle but as a solemn testament. He stressed that each viewer must approach the photograph with respect and reflection, understanding that it represents lives abruptly ended, not mere historical abstraction. In quiet moments, Jameson reflected on the paradoxical life of the photograph. It had brought him recognition and connection, yet it had also deepened the burden of memory he carried. The faces he had captured were now known to thousands, even millions, but the weight of their suffering remained intimately his. He realized that photographs like his serve as bridges between the past and present, yet they also demand moral engagement. To look at the image passively is to fail the memory it preserves. To acknowledge it fully is to confront the uncomfortable reality of humanity's capacity for both evil and compassion. Over time, Jameson also began corresponding with survivors and descendants of victims. Letters arrived from across Europe, offering pieces of the human story that the photograph could not convey on its own. Some wrote to confirm identities, others to share personal memories, and some to simply express gratitude for preserving a moment that might otherwise have been forgotten. Through these exchanges, Jameson came to understand that the photograph was not static. It was a living artifact, continually reshaped by memory, interpretation, and testimony. It connected past and present, individual and collective experience, forming a network of remembrance that transcended borders and generations. Despite these connections, Jameson never allowed himself to forget the personal toll of witnessing and recording such events. He continued to confront the emotional weight of the photograph in private, revisiting the diary entries he had kept since the war, reflecting on the moral and psychological challenges of survival. The photograph reminded him that bearing witness is not a neutral act. It shapes the witness as much as it documents the events witnessed. Memory, responsibility, and moral awareness were inseparable in his mind, each reinforcing the other in a complex interplay that defined the rest of his life. Ultimately, the photograph became more than a historical document. It became a moral compass. It guided Jameson in his interactions with others, informed his sense of justice, and strengthened his commitment to truth. Each time someone asked him why he continued to speak about the past, why he carried the image with him, he replied simply, "Because they cannot speak. I can." In this way, the photograph lived on not only in archives and exhibitions, but in the conscience of those who encountered it, ensuring that the memory of the victims would endure long after those who captured it were gone. As the years turned into decades, Jameson realized that the photograph's journey was far from over. While it had served as evidence in trials and as a teaching tool in classrooms, it also forced him to confront questions he had long avoided, questions about morality, complicity, and the fragility of human conscience. The photograph did not merely record a moment in time. It exposed the consequences of silence, the dangers of indifference, and the urgent need for vigilance in the face of injustice. For Jameson, the act of bearing witness was inseparable from these questions. In the quiet of his home, he would often sit with the photograph and reflect on the choices that had led him to that fateful moment. Why had he raised his camera when so many others had fled in horror? Why had he survived when so many others had not? These were questions without easy answers, yet they demanded consideration. The photograph had become a mirror, reflecting not only the suffering of the victims, but also his own conscience. Each time he studied the faces, he confronted the uncomfortable truth that witnessing is both a privilege and a burden, one that carries moral weight beyond the limits of law or history. The photograph also compelled him to confront the wider societal implications of memory. Jameson watched as post-war Europe rebuilt itself, as political alliances shifted, and as old prejudices resurfaced in new forms. He saw that forgetting was not a neutral act. It was an invitation for history to repeat itself. The image he had captured became a lens through which he evaluated contemporary events, a benchmark for recognizing injustice in all its guises. It reminded him that memory is not simply personal. It is collective, and its preservation is essential to the moral health of a society. During this period, Jameson began speaking more openly about the long-term psychological effects of war. He described the nights haunted by images that refused to fade, the moments of anxiety triggered by ordinary sounds or sights, and the challenge of reintegration into a society that seemed oblivious to the depth of his experience. Through these discussions, he hoped to expand the understanding of wartime trauma, emphasizing that the consequences of conflict extend far beyond the battlefield. The photograph, in his account, was both the source and symbol of this ongoing struggle, a visual representation of the invisible scars carried by survivors. Jameson also encountered younger generations who had only learned about the war through textbooks and films. He found that the photograph sparked questions that challenged complacency. Why did people allow such atrocities to happen? How could ordinary individuals participate or remain silent in the face of evil? These discussions were difficult, often uncomfortable, yet they were essential. Jameson realized that the photograph's true power lay in its ability to provoke dialogue across generations, to encourage moral reflection, and to instill a sense of responsibility for preventing future horrors. At times, Jameson struggled with despair. He saw conflicts erupt around the world, communities torn apart by hatred, prejudice, and authoritarianism. The The photograph reminded him that the conditions that gave rise to the horrors he had witnessed were not confined to history. It was a stark warning. The lessons of the past must be continually applied, or they are at risk of being forgotten. And yet, in these moments of discouragement, the photograph also offered hope. Its very existence demonstrated that truth could survive, that memory could endure, and that bearing witness, though difficult, was a profoundly meaningful act. By confronting the past in both personal and public ways, Jameson came to a deeper understanding of his own purpose. The photograph was not simply a relic of history. It was a tool for education, reflection, and moral accountability. It demanded that he speak, that he listen, and that he act. Through it, he maintained a connection to those who could no longer speak for themselves, ensuring that their stories were not lost to time. And in doing so, he realized that the act of remembrance is both a responsibility and a gift, a chance to honor the past while guiding the future. In the final analysis, Jameson understood that the photograph would forever remain a companion, a witness, and a guide. It carried the weight of memory, the burden of truth, and the promise of moral vigilance. And as he continued to share its story, he reaffirmed a profound truth. History cannot be changed, but it can be remembered, and through remembrance, humanity can aspire toward justice, compassion, and understanding. In the twilight of his life, Jameson came to understand that the photograph he had taken decades earlier had become far more than a personal testament. It had become a legacy, a bridge between generations, and a moral compass for those willing to confront the truths of history. Though the horrors it captured were confined to a single moment in time, the photograph's influence extended outward, touching educators, historians, students, and everyday citizens who encountered it. It was a reminder that the past, however painful, shapes the present, and that memory, carefully preserved and shared, carries the power to guide humanity. Jameson devoted his later years to ensuring that the photograph's story would endure. He worked with museums, archives, and educational institutions to provide context, personal testimony, and moral reflection alongside the image. The goal was never sensationalism. It was the sober, careful transmission of truth. Visitors to exhibits were encouraged to reflect, to ask questions, and to understand that what they were seeing represented real human lives. Lives abruptly ended, dreams extinguished, families shattered. In this way, the photograph became not only an artifact but also a teacher, challenging each viewer to consider their own role in preventing injustice. He also published memoirs and essays recounting his experiences, always emphasizing that the photograph was not just a historical record but a call to ethical engagement. His writings explored the responsibilities of those who witnessed suffering, the moral imperatives of remembrance, and the enduring consequences of silence. Scholars praised his insights, noting that his work illuminated the intersection of memory, morality, and history. Yet Jameson remained humble, insisting that he was merely one voice among countless witnesses, and that the photograph was ultimately more important than its bearer. As the years progressed, Jameson received letters from across the globe. Some were from survivors or their descendants, offering gratitude, clarification, or personal recollections connected to the photograph. Others were from students and educators, expressing how the image had changed their understanding of history, compassion, and human responsibility. Each letter reinforced the enduring significance of the photograph, demonstrating that its impact extended far beyond the courtroom, the classroom, or the pages of scholarly journals. It had become a living testament, continuously shaping perceptions, values, and ethical awareness. Despite his advancing age, Jameson never ceased reflecting on the moral dimensions of his act of witnessing. He understood that taking the photograph had been a decision fraught with ethical complexity, balancing the need to document against the instinct to protect, to intervene, or to flee. These reflections shaped his philosophy of memory, that history is not merely a collection of facts, but a mosaic of human experience, moral choice, and consequence. The photograph encapsulated these lessons with stark clarity, serving as a reminder that each individual, no matter how ordinary, can bear witness to extraordinary truths. Jameson also recognized the limitations of what any single image could convey. While the photograph captured horror and truth, It could not encapsulate the full depth of human experience, nor could it convey the resilience, courage, and small acts of kindness that persisted even amidst atrocity. He spoke openly about this to visitors and students, urging them to consider the broader context and to seek out voices that were often marginalized or overlooked. In this sense, the photograph was both a window and a doorway. It offered a glimpse into the past, but also invited deeper exploration, reflection, and understanding. In the final years of his life, Jameson found peace in the knowledge that the photograph had fulfilled its purpose. It had borne witness to what could not speak for itself. It had shaped public understanding of history, and it had inspired generations to reflect on the consequences of indifference. He understood that memory is not static, that it requires care, attention, and transmission from one generation to the next. By preserving and sharing the photograph, he had ensured that the stories it contained would continue to resonate long after he was gone. On quiet evenings, Jameson would sit by his window, the photograph carefully placed beside him, and reflect on the journey that had begun with a single click of the shutter. He felt the weight of memory, the solemn responsibility of truth, and the quiet satisfaction that his act of witnessing had mattered. The faces in the image, once silent, once fleeting, once a private burden, had become permanent guides, reminding him, and the world, that history must be remembered, that justice must be pursued, and that humanity must never forget. In the end, the legacy of the lens was not only the photograph itself, but the conscience it awakened, the stories it preserved, and the moral clarity it demanded. Jameson understood that in capturing a single moment, he had created a bridge between the past and the present, a testament to the enduring power of memory, and a warning for the future, that witnessing is a sacred duty, and that the truth, once seen, must never be ignored.